Okay, Be'ezrat Hashem, let's start. Just a quick review of what we learned 2 weeks ago. You see what we learned, he explains in short that when God created the world, right, his main dwelling was on earth. But because of sins of generations from Adam and future generations, so God removed himself to the seventh heaven. Then after Avraham Avinu came, until Moshe Rabbeinu brought him back on earth. That's what it says, Basi, Legani, I came back to my garden. When did that happen in terms of Moshe Rabbeinu? When he made the Mishkan, the tabernacle. So then he explains that just like there was a physical Mishkan, every Jew could make himself a dwelling place for God also. Now, even though in general doing Torah and Mitzvot, it reveals godliness, but as he proves it from Zohar, I think, that the main way that really reveals the true essence of God, the real Or Ein Sof, God the Infinite, is only if there is a challenge and we work on the challenge. And he says there are two levels, either the level of Itkafia, which means the person subdues and fights the Yetzer Hara. That means the Yetzer Hara is there, I don't transform it. It's always there, bothering a human being. But he fights back, he doesn't listen. So where there's a challenge, he reveals, Yekara de Kuchabrichu, the glory of God, God's main essence. Or even a higher level where he will transform his animalistic soul to Kedusha, to holiness, which we're going to study in this parak today, how that is done. So that's what we learned in the first parak. And then it goes in the second parak and he says, no matter how much of godliness was revealed when Moshe Rabbeinu made the Mishkan, but once the Beit HaMikdash was built and they brought the sacrifices, so that revealed even a higher level of godliness, the real essence of God. Before we get even into that, we know that the sacrifices have a very main, what do you call it? They're like a centerpiece in Judaism, because the whole book of Vayikra talks about sacrifices, right? Then also when we look at the holidays in the Torah, every time it mentions holidays, bring this sacrifice, these additional sacrifices. In the olden days, the only way that a person got forgiven, in addition to do repentance.
Do we bring sacrifices on the Day of Atonement?
On Yom Kippur, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Musaf. That's why we have a Musaf prayer, because that corresponds to the additional sacrifices that was brought. The only way that the complete forgiveness came in the olden days with repenting was to bring sacrifices. So we see that sacrifices have a very big deal there. So that's even in the simple sense. Here it comes and says that one of the main services in the Mishkan was the sacrifices. Why? Because the main thing that reveals godliness is when you do it kafia, subdue the Yetzer Hara, you transform things from unholiness, from darkness to holiness. That was the concept of sacrifices. That you took an animal which is completely unholy, when they burnt it on the altar, it actually got burnt in the heavenly fire. That was a transformation of the animal to Kedusha. Then he goes on to say that really sacrifices, first of all, even in the temple, they were a spiritual service. How much more so in the body of a human being, in the service of a human being? How do we see that it was a spiritual thing in the temple? Because first of all, you had many Kohanim working together, and the Levim used to sing at the time of pouring of the wine during the sacrifices, which singing is definitely something spiritual. Then I think the Rabbi brings from the Medrash, that the Medrash actually learns from the Pasuk when it says about the sacrifices. It says that Korbani Lachmi Leishai Reyach Nichochi, that my fire sacrifices, which are sweet smell, Tishmiru, continuously bring it. And I was talking to all the Jews, right? Where did the Jews have a part in the sacrifices? So it says that every week they had like a different group of Jews, that they were the Shaliach, the Shluchim, the messenger of the Jews, that used to pray at that time that the sacrifices should be accepted. Definitely the prayer of these, the Shluchim of the Jews, prayer is something very spiritual. So the Levim singing, the Kohanim working together, and their prayers, which they were called the Ma'amadot, which means standing, people that stood as agents of the Jews.
These weren't Levites?
No, the Levites sang. Kohanim brought the sacrifice.
You're talking about the men who would fast from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday.
Well, part of it was fasting. I don't know all the details, right? So some of them stood up by the sacrifices and they prayed that it should be accepted. Definitely praying is something very spiritual. So now if in the temple, which is a physical structure, the sacrifices were spiritual, how much more so in our service, in our soul. Now what is the sacrifices by us? So he brings a very interesting point that the Torah, when it talks about laws of sacrifice, says, Adam ki yakriv mikem. If a person brings a sacrifice from amongst you, which is a little bit confusing, it sounds like you bring a sacrifice from a human. Adam, a person, ki yakriv, that brings a sacrifice mikem, from you. But we know that human sacrifices are not allowed. The Torah should have said, Adam mikem, a human being from amongst you, ki yakriv, that will bring sacrifice. Not a person that brings a sacrifice mikem. Right? So anyways, he says the reason why the Torah writes it in such a way is because it's trying to hint to us about the spiritual sacrifices. And what does mikem mean? So it says like this: mikem has two meanings. From you. Adam ki yakriv means when a person wants to get close to God. It doesn't only mean when you bring a sacrifice.
To consecrate yourself?
Right. Because the whole concept of sacrifice is to get closer to God. You know, whether I bring it because I did a sin, I want to bring a gift to God, that brings me closer to God. So Adam ki yakriv, when a person wants to get close to God, mikem. What does mikem mean? So he brings two explanations. One is from himself, the previous Rabbi. He says that mikem means that it really depends on us. If I really want to get close to God, I could get. Now, why is it such a big deal that the Torah says that? It looks like I would think otherwise. If not for the Torah saying it, I would have thought that, no, I can't get close to God. It doesn't depend on me. I'm a lost case. The Torah is saying, no, it depends on. If you want to get close to God, you can get close to God. Why is that such a big chidush? So it says because by the sacrifices there is a law that if the kohen or if the sacrifice is blemished, so then you cannot bring the sacrifice. Correct? So now when a person sins, he's blemished. So therefore he might think, how is it possible that if we get close to God, especially we know we are sinful, right? We have done many, many wrong things. So then I'm blemished. How could I get close to God? Right? That's what a person might think. So that's a chidush of the Torah, that no matter what happens to a person before what he has done, if he wants to get close to God, stop doing the wrong stuff and get close to God, he could get close to God. So now this is the way he explains the Torah. Where does he have a proof to that? So he brings a couple of midrashim that actually prove it. Number one, there's a in Tana Develiyo, that over there it says that every Jew could demand of himself, when will my actions reach the actions of Avraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov? I'm not talking about reaching the level of spirituality, but in action. When will my actions reach the action of Avraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov? So now if it's impossible for a sinner to get close to God, how could he even demand of himself that his actions should equal to the actions of Avraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov? Doesn't make any sense. So from there we see that actually if a Jew wants to get close to God, he can. And actually that Midrash explains the reason why, because we know a father or a mother, they give their character traits to their children as an inheritance. So since Avram is called our father and he was very close to God, he puts that potential in every single Jew. So that's proof number one from Tana Develiyahu, that any Jew says, every Jew could say, Kol echad vechad miYisrael, any Jew could say, when can I get close to God? And he also brings a Gemara and a Medrash. The Gemara says that God will never come with trouble or with burden with his creations. So if he wants us to get close to him, right, it's not burdensome. It's in our power. That's what the Gemara says. And then the Medrash goes on to say, whenever God asks something from us, he asks in accordance with our ability, not God's infinite ability. I think we discussed that there are 3 places that we find this. When he gave the 10 commandments, right, after the first 2, the Jews died. Then God had to revive them. So then afterwards, God spoke to Moshe, and Moshe gave them the 10 commandments. So God says, because I come to you based on your power. Also, when they made the golden calf, right? So they wanted an atonement. So God tells Moshe, I'm going to give half a shekel. So Moshe says, come on, how could half a shekel bring an atonement? Come on. Even if they give all the money in the world, doesn't bring an atonement. So God answered them that I only ask them based on their potentials, on their power, not according to my power. And then the other thing was when God asked for sacrifices, so Moshe says, even if you bring all the animals in the world, would that satisfy you, God? So God says, I'm not asking according to my ability, I'm asking according to their ability. If they bring 1 sheep in the morning and 1 sheep in the afternoon, they have done their obligation to bring the sacrifices. So from this that we see God comes to everybody based on his potential, right? So that means even if a person is a sinner and he wants to get close to God, God will allow him. He's not beyond his power. So these are the 2 proofs that he brings. Anyway, so that's what it means. Adam ki yakriv. When a person wants to get close to God, Mikem depends on him. That's a chidush of the previous Rebbe. The first Rebbe of Chabad, the Alter Rebbe says Mikem means from yourself. That means if you want to get close to God, Mikem Karban, you have to sacrifice from within yourself. Which part of ourselves we have to sacrifice? The animal with us. That's what the Torah says, Mikem, Karban Lashem, Mina Behema, from the animal, Mina Bakar, Mina Tzon, from the ox, and from the sheep. So these are the animals within us. If we want to get close to God, we have to sacrifice our animal. And we said there's in both ways. Either to control it, not to do what the animal wants, or actually to transform that as we see today. Now what does the Torah actually count? Two types of animals, bakar and so on. So it says because somebody's Yetzirah is like an ox. And we explain an ox, what kind of Yetzirah is that? Either he's angry, like an ox which is gores, or he's completely an insensitive person. Like an ox that's not sensitive. That's one type of Yetzirah. Person with such a Yetzirah gets close to God by controlling these two things. Either not to get angry or not to be insensitive to others. Try to be more sensitive. Then sheep is an animal which is sensitive. It's not an angry animal. Doesn't gore. It's very, how to call it? Very, I don't know. I can't use the word civil. But it's domesticated or is very, very calm animal. But at the same time, it shows on a person who's very pleasure-seeking. As we have many people that are nice people, they give lots of charity, they love other people, but they're really...
compared to a sheep? Are sheep...
Are they after pleasures? I'm not sure, but they're definitely very, very kind animal.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, I think what it is, a sheep always follows others. They're never really leaders. So also follows, whatever most people follow, the pleasures of the world. That's very possible. Anyway, so it shows on a pleasure-seeking person. So such a person has to work on his Yetzirah, not to go after pleasures. Okay, that's how we get close to God. So anyways, this is as far as we learned last week. It was a very long review. We're holding on page 32. Be'ezrat Hashem, we're going to finish till page 34, God willing. And it's actually a very interesting parak. So on page 32, the second paragraph, Vehine. Vehine ba korban gashmi, by physical sacrifice, hu shemivin behema gashmi salga b'mizbeach. They brought a physical animal on the altar. V'hoy ha'esh shelamayla. Now even though the Kohanim brought their own fire, but the sacrifice did not burn in times of Moshe Rabbeinu, and also in times of the first Beit HaMikdash, Shlomo HaMelech, until Menashe came and contaminated the Beit HaMikdash. There was always a fire. The fire came once from heaven, and it always stayed on the altar. That's what burned the sacrifices. That's what it says. They brought an animal, and there was a Eish Shelamayla. There was a fire that came from heaven. Where do we know that from? Ukedeita beyuma, it's a Gemara. The Gemara says in Yuma, Revutza Kari. This fire was crouching on the altar like a lion. And Rashi explains, what do you mean he was crouching like a lion? It was a coal that fell from heaven, Bimei Shlomo, in times of King Solomon, and it was on the altar. Now the Gemara doesn't say what it did, it just says it was there. But the Zohar says, this lion, this coal that crouched like a lion, it consumed the sacrifice. So by the physical temple, it was a fire from above that burned the sacrifices. Now let's go back to the animal within us. So we are saying that there is a fire from heaven that has to burn the animal within us. What does that mean? There is a fire from heaven in every Jewish person. These are the flames of the fire in the godly soul, which are the flames of love. Because we have a godly soul in us, right? Godly soul is a godly being. So since he's a godly being, what does he love? He definitely doesn't love physical pleasures, because he has no connection to that. It's a godly thing.
It loves holiness.
It loves God. Simply loves God, holiness, right? So that is called the fire of God. That's a Eish Shelamayla, the fire from above. The love within the nefesh, in the godly soul. Ukemaimer, and he brings a proof. There's actually a verse, there's a pasuk in Shir HaShirim, that it says, Reshafeha, the soul's fire, Rish Be'esh, it's a flaming fire. Shalheveska, it's a flame of God. Clearly calls this love of fire Shalheveska, it's a flame of God. So you don't need to go to Kabbalah to learn that. Shlomo HaMelech says that in Shir HaShirim. What is this Reshafarish Vehesh? What's this, burning fire within every Jew? Shalheveska, it's a flame from God. Now on this pasuk, there is a medrash. The medrash says, Ke'esh shelamayla. Why is this love called fire from above? Because it's very similar to the fire from above that came on the altar. What was that? She'ena esh mechabel lemayim. Because that fire wouldn't extinguish water. And water wouldn't extinguish that fire. So this love that we have, the waters cannot extinguish that. Now, what is the water that tries to extinguish the love that we have to God but is not successful? So he's going to explain. Naturally, every godly soul loves God. And is similar to the flame from above. To that water cannot extinguish it. On page 33. What is this water? Rabbi. Shlomo himself says in Shir HaShirim, these are the turbulent or many, many waters. What is the many waters? So first of all, the difficulty that a person has to simply make a livelihood. One of the things that the Ramchal writes down says if a person doesn't want to fall into sin, or what actually causes a person to fall into sin is our preoccupation in the physical world. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. We have to, for example, even the cheapest house you want to live in, cheapest apartment. Right? You have a family, you want to have a 2-bedroom apartment, right? In a decent Jewish area, is at least, 1,500-1,600, if not more.
Exactly.
Okay, that's it. You have to have insurance, right? That's another $500-600. You have electricity, right? You got the gas, you got this and that, the car, whatever it is. Just to live minimum, you need probably more than $3,000 a month. Just to live minimum, barely. That's even before you send your kids to Jewish schools, right? So we are so much preoccupied and we're so much disturbed making a living that we don't have time to think about God. We're always running to cover the bank. Just run to cover the bank. So then, instead of utilizing the time, to think about God, how close God is to us, how much we should love God, we are so much involved in the physical world, there's so much distractions, that actually those things, I'm not saying it's going to extinguish, but it definitely doesn't help to arouse the love to God. So this is called Ma'im Rabbi. So it says one of the ways is a person shouldn't be preoccupied in the world. Just do the minimum. Study Torah more. So like that, the love of God will actually burn within a Jewish person. So he says, what is this? Ma'im Rabbim, the many, many waters, the trouble that you have to make money. Then he says, Ubilbulim, there's other distractions too, not just making a living. The media, the garbage that's going on, the politics that's going on. These are a bunch of, confusions and disturbances, which they disturb a person from studying and actually serving God. We're always rushing, I have to go to work, so I have to rush through prayers. I don't care which group we go to, unless, we go to yeshiva, that the only thing that I have is only study, eat, and pray. But any other place, there's always rushing. Very few people, they dive in a long time. So even though we have all these troubles, nevertheless, in a gam hanolish Shlomo goes on, not only many waters, but even the rivers, which was on a very, very heavy, currency of water, they will not wash away the love. Why not? Because this love in the godly soul, is like the fire above, then the water cannot extinguish. So this is one thing. No matter what a Jew does, the fire is always in his heart and never gets extinguished. The previous Rabbi actually goes and he brings a hint from it, from the Torah. I think it's in Parshat Chukat or Balak. It's Balak, Parshat Balak. When Balak comes to curse the Jews, right? Bilam comes to curse the Jews. So Bilam, he couldn't curse. God turns it into blessings. So one of the praises that he says about the Jews, he says, Merosh Tsuri Merenu. I see them from top of rocks. Rashi explains simply, what does rocks mean? Mountains. That the Jews are standing on top of very tall mountains, Avram, Yitzhak, Yaakov. Then it says, Umikivos are seen from top of hills. Who are the hills? Our mothers. Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. The previous Rebbe says, Tsur doesn't mean a regular rock or regular mountain. Tzur means a flint stone. These are type of stones that when you strike them, fire comes out. So what, according to the way the Frierdiker Rebbe explains it, the previous Rebbe, is that every Jew is compared to a flint stone. Why? So it says because even if you put a flint stone in the water for thousands of years, when you take it out and you strike it on another stone, fire comes out. So you see, water cannot take away that, the concept of fire, the element of fire, which is in the flint stone. That's why Jews compare to a rock, to a flintstone. Even let's say if he's underwater for, let's say, tens of years, he has been sinful, he has done wrong stuff, but the fire deep down is within him. Okay, nothing extinguishes that. And in this fire, the love of God, we have to sacrifice the animal soul. Meaning, simple terms, I have to convince the animal soul to love God. Just like physically the animal was burnt and consumed by the fire, it became part of the fire. The animal soul, although loves physical pleasures, he has to be consumed by the godly soul, meaning that it should also come to love God. As we see how. Should also love God. Okay, first of all, is this possible? It sounds very nice, but and also whatever the previous Rebbe says, there has to have a source in the Torah. So it brings a pasuk for that. But before we go further, remember we said in sacrifices there is two ways. There is itkafia, to subdue, and then there's ithapcha, to transform, right? So in the physical temple there was transformation, because the flesh of the animal burnt in the fire. You took an unholy animal, you made it holy. By us, when we sacrifice our animal soul, there is two levels. There is the itkafia, by some people, by most people, we just fight against the Yetzer Hara, but not necessarily my animalistic soul is going to come to love God. Then there's a higher level, just like the temple, just like the Beit HaMikdash. What we do, we actually transform our animal soul to come to love God too. That's what it means. Within the godly fire, the love of the neshama, the animal soul should be consumed. It should also come to love God. Now, first of all, is such thing possible? So he says, even before we study Chassidus, it's a clear pasuk that we say every single day. We say in the Shema, you shall love the Lord your God with your hearts. Now, if the Torah wanted to say to love God with your heart, it should have said bechol libcha, because in Hebrew, heart is leiv, right? Your heart is libcha.
Libcha?
Your heart. Just like libi means my heart, libcha means your heart. But the Torah says levavcha, with your hearts. That's how the Rabbi is explaining. That means a person has two hearts. So the Torah is telling us, love God. What?
He was talking about the congregation of the many hearts among the Jews?
Well, it doesn't say v'ahavtem, it says v'ahavta. It's talking to a single person. So it should have said libcha. Right? So he says, what does it mean, two hearts? So the rabbis explained, with both of your inclinations. It's a Mishnah this way.
The Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov.
Right. The Gama Nefesh Bahamas Yulav, that even the animalistic soul should come to love God. So we see it's even a pasuk that we say every day in Shema. And who explains the Shema that way? It's a Mishnah, Masechta Brachot. The Mishnah Perek Tes of Masechta Brachot says, B'chol levavcha means with both your hearts, Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara. So this is what the Mishnah says, but the Mishnah doesn't explain how. So the Rambam over there explains what does it mean love God with even with Yetzer Hara. So the Rambam says in simple terms, there are things that we do because our soul loves to do. That's basically mitzvot, tefillin. It's not something that my body loves to do, it's the godly soul. There are things that the body enjoys to do. Eating, sleeping, drinking. So it says even when you do that, don't indulge, do it for the sake of God. Eat because it should be healthy to serve God. So we're not talking about transformation of the animal soul to godliness, but when it says both of your inclinations, things that the body, the animal soul enjoys, don't do it for the sake of the indulgence, control it. Just eat enough to stay healthy. Don't indulge. But here the previous Rebbe says it means more than that. It means actually that it should come to love God. That's what it means. Because the pasuk says, "Ve'ahavta," love the Lord your God with both your hearts. So it's not just, do the action to serve God. It literally means come to love God. Even the other heart, the Yetzer Hara, the Nefesh, should come to love God. How does that happen? So it says on page 33, that happens when the godly soul is invested and is enclosed in the animal soul. Right? Because it is within the animal soul. So then, since they're within each other, right? So even though the animal soul covers over the godly soul, but a godly soul could affect it to come to love God. Yeah, you gotta open it back there. How's that? So it says, in the beginning. In the beginning, the animal soul is not sensitive and he has no understanding of godliness whatsoever.
We have a lady who wants to join us on the class.
For a while. Hello.
Hi. Come in.
Do you want me to sit over there?
You can come in the front.
I was.
Hey, how are you? Baruch Hashem, I'm so glad you came.
Just don't get discouraged. If
Okay.
it's a little bit difficult in the beginning,
Okay.
but you get used to it. You're only on page 33.
Oh, it's on.
So what we're studying now is that how could a person come and convince even his animal soul to come to love God? That's how we got. This is the concept of spiritual sacrifice. You know, just like the animal used to get burnt by heavenly fire. So he explains that the heavenly fire is the love that every Jew has to God, which is within his godly soul. So then he could actually consume and make the animal soul, although naturally he loves physical things, should come to love God too. How does that happen? So he explains because God puts the godly soul within the animal soul. So the godly soul could work on the animal soul. How's that? So you're holding on page 33, the last two paragraphs. Starts the Tchila. In the beginning, animal soul has no understanding or feeling of godliness whatsoever. Because why is it called the animal soul? Not because it's vicious. An animal only understands bodily pleasures. So the animal soul within us, it only goes after physical pleasures. So obviously it doesn't understand spirituality at all. That's in the beginning. But now we have a godly soul too. Now what's the difference of the godly soul and the animal soul? The godly soul is part of God, right? His real essence is his godly intellect. What our godly soul is capable of is understanding the goodness of godliness, how God is one, everything is nullified to God. There's ways to explain it. There are many Maimonim that explain that, how the fact that we see the world as an independent thing is an illusion. I'm not saying the world is an illusion. God created the world. But the fact that we see the world is totally independent, it's running by itself, right? That's a real being. That's an illusion. So Chassidus explains that how. So this is something that really the godly soul understands, that the main thing is God. One of the good examples that Rabbi Zamir Cohen brings down is, imagine you're watching a movie, right? Just imagine that the electricity goes off, right? The screen is black, right? It's out. So he wants to say it's really energy of God that gives existence to everything. If God's energy would be removed even for a second, it's not that the world would melt. The world would disappear. It's very hard for us to understand, But the best example that I saw brings is from a movie. You see people, the screen, everything, but as soon as electricity goes out, there's nothing. So that's what the godly soul understands. Right? He thinks this godly thought that even the animal soul can understand it. Now to go into details about this, usually in Chassidus we learn that a person has two souls. There's a godly soul and there's an animal soul, right? As we said, the godly soul is an intellectual being that understands godliness. The animal soul goes after physical pleasures. But in many places it says there is a middle soul in between two. We Jews and non-Jews alike have that. It's called the intellectual soul, or nefesh ha-sichlit. That means the intellectual soul. So what's the difference? Again, the godly soul is an intellectually godly being. It's a godly being which is very intellectual, understands godliness. Now the emotions which are created from that understanding is called the Yetzer Tov, the good inclination, okay? So again, the neshama itself, the godly soul, is intellectual being. His main thing is intellect. When he understands godliness and he comes to love God, so therefore there are emotions those emotions are called Yetzer Tov. Nefesh HaSichli, the intellectual Seichel, it's talking about the human intellect, not a godly intellect. That even though he understands physical things better, understand 2 tables plus 2 tables is 4. But godliness is very abstract, but he has some understanding about godliness and spirituality too. You have had many people that have reached great heights, even non-Jews I'm talking about, that don't have that godly soul. They have a human soul, they actually come to understand a lot of godly things. So when the godly soul thinks about these things, so the intellectual soul gets it too. And then he explains it to the animal soul too. Because the animal soul really is not bad. The animal soul is just a desire. But because it's in a physical body, he wants physical things. You get that? There's a difference of Yetzirah and the animal soul. Animal soul is desire. Could be to anything. But because it's in a physical body, he wants physical desires. And some of them are bad, if it's sinful. But once the godly soul explains to him, through the Nefesh HaSichlit, the intellectual soul, he will come to understand, you know what? Not everything is the physical pleasures. Godliness makes sense too. So eventually could bring him to love God.
The Yetzer Tov? Like, because...
The Yetzer Tov is the love of God.
Chassidus, it explains, how it goes from the heart, the desire goes from the heart to the brain, and then the brain activates to think about, or the neshama in the brain somehow battles against that desire.
That's from the Yetzirah. That's from the Yetzirah. The way it works, the neshama understands God and it creates love. The animal soul starts from the heart.
Yeah.
And he sends a message to the head, how to get it.
Yeah.
So then the godly soul fights if he wants to fight.
So is that what you're talking about, or is that a different...
I'm not talking about that, no. I'm talking about, concepts of godliness that I'm learning.
Alright, okay.
When I understand it, right, it's not that it stays in the godly soul, doesn't penetrate the intellectual soul. It penetrates the intellectual soul too.
Yeah.
And eventually the animal soul understands it too. Okay?
And then, so like an example of an intellectual understanding of Hashem would be like scientific, intellectual.
It could be anything that brings you to understand God, but you want a simple example which I could bring. Okay, now one of the things that Chassidus explains is that this world is an illusion, right? I mean, the fact that you see it independent. One of the ways that they prove it is, the Alter Rebbe says, if God would not create the world for a second, the world would become nothing. You would go back to before creation. Again, not that the flood would come, not that it would melt, no. Because then there's still something existing. It would become as if the world was never created. So one of the proofs that he brings is, when we throw a stone up, right? As much as the energy is there, the stone goes against gravity. But as soon as my energy stops, it goes back down. Because the status is that the ground, makes everything come down. If you want to go against the nature, so you have to have an energy that works against it. Now the question is the world really existing or non-existence? So Chassidus says the world is really non-existence. Why? Because if it did exist, why in the beginning there was only God, nothing else?
Whoa, can you say that again?
If the status quo of the world is to exist, so why in the beginning there was only God, there was no world? The status, if you believe in, if you don't believe in God, the whole thing doesn't make sense. So obviously the status quo was only God. The world couldn't be there. Because otherwise, why did you need God to create it? And remember, there was no mass that God made a big bang. There was nothing. There was no space. There wasn't even anything that God should shape it into the world. So status quo is godliness, nothing to exist. To create a world was something new, against its nature. The nature of the world is not to exist.
It's against...
Because there was only God, there was nothing else there. You see, if let's say there was a mass before God or at the same time as God, Chas v'Shalom, so then the status quo is there's a mass and there's a God. But we believe that there was only God, no space, nothing. So the status quo is non-existence, as far as we are concerned. Only God exists. So for God to create a world, he had to go against its nature.
Its nature, okay.
So then he has to be there constantly 24 hours. If for a second God stops creating, so it's like the stone coming down. The world would go...
God is still creating right now.
Right, even right now, exactly. Every second is... And we said in prayers, HaMechadesh betuvo b'chol yom tamid. God renews the world every day, constantly. It's in our prayers. What was your question?
I guess intellectual understanding, because I know there's the animal soul and the godly soul, and the middle is the there's like this intellectual understanding. Would that be like in meditation? Because we've scientifically proven that your heart actually has an intellect of its own, and your heart tends to, it's called intuition, before your brain registers it, and it's scientifically has been proven in several different ways, both like linearly and controlled and non-controlled. Anyway, it's been proven, and there are other things that have been proven, like energy and growth and all these things. And then, so I guess you intellectually understand that there is this energy out there, and there is a both positive and negative, and an atheist would be someone who would say, I don't know if there is an existence of God, but I believe that there is something.
It's agnostic.
Or agnostic.
Asking a very difficult. Okay, go ahead.
So I guess the question is that the intellectual understanding? And at some point, even an agnostic sort of ignites the animal soul with his intellect.
Well, you see, what I'm explaining is a believer. That's what I'm explaining right now. But I honestly think even somebody who's agnostic or something deep down knows there's a God. You just, if you're going to say there's a God, then you have to follow the rules. If you say, I don't know, there's a certain superpower, then I could do whatever I want as long as I don't hurt people.
Yeah.
I think deep down they even believe that there is a God. But I'm talking, from a religious point of view, that we believe that there is a God. And he's explaining that really everything that we see is dependent on God, is really non-existence. So then, let me just finish it off. So if I'm going to go after physical pleasures, I'm going after illusions. I'm going after nothingness. This is what Chassidus says. We don't even need Chassidus for that. If you look at books of Musar, they say, for example, all these physical things are not eternal.
So when we say tefillin is physical and an illusion, but what we achieve with the tefillin is
Well,
real.
no, not that tefillin is the fact that you feel it's independent from God, that is existing on its own. That's the illusion.
That's existing on its, that it's right there.
That it doesn't need God to continue existing. It's like a table,
it has a sense of self. That's
Right.
what it is. That something, it's like something has a sense that, I could exist by myself.
Right. An example that I bring is, let's say a carpenter makes this, whatever company makes this table. Yeah, the guy that made it could come with an axe and break it, but as long as it doesn't mix in, it continues on its own. So some people think that the world is the same way too. Yeah, God created it. If not for God creating it, the world wouldn't exist. But now that He created it, the world runs on its own. Yeah, God could mix in, bring a fire, do something, but the world runs on its own. So that's what Alter Rebbe says. That's not a good analogy at all, because the table, the wood, was there before the carpenter came. So you didn't really create the wood. The wood was there, you just changed the shape. So just like the wood existed without the carpenter, so this could also continue. But in the beginning, there was no mass that God changed it or shaped it into the world. There was nothing. So the status quo is non-existent. So that's why the world has to be recreated every single moment. So let's say, because we ourselves are illusion, thinking that I'm independent, I don't need God. That's the whole challenge. Otherwise, we have no challenge. Anyway, so you see, when a person sees that, and the Nefesh HaBahamis understands it, believe me, if we really work on ourselves, we will not go so much after the physical pleasures. And after many years of work, but really have to work hard. Somebody could even have his animal soul desiring God. You don't have to go even that far with Chassidus. Books of Musa explain it too, like the Ramchal explains, that if you go after physical pleasures, first of all, they're not eternal. How much can a person eat? Until he has his teeth? By the age of 75, when we turn 50, we can't eat anymore, to be honest. Right? You can't eat all the steaks and meat and the fats and stuff. That's it. And then when we reach older age, especially people that have diabetes, God forbid, or something, they have to really cut on carbs and rice. That's it. Godliness is something that continues forever. He brings a very beautiful example. All the food that we see, they're so nice and beautiful. It's only beautiful till it enters our mouth. You see, caterings make it look so nice. Imagine the food goes into my mouth and I spit it out. I know it's disgusting. I will never eat it again. But that was the food that you were going crazy 2 minutes ago. So the whole beauty of the food is only before it enters somebody's mouth. He says a very interesting thing. The more we eat, more sickness comes. So even if somebody hasn't learned Chassidus, right, he knows that everything else is detrimental to somebody's health and existence, but godliness is not. Chassidus goes deeper. It's not that it's detrimental. They're non-existent. The fact that you see them as an independent thing. The real life is God. So why do you go after The nothingness, go after the main thing, which is God. So that's what the godly soul can explain to the animal soul. Is that clear? So this will bring even the animal soul closer to godliness. Like it says in another place, it's like there's a etching or there's a scratch, engraving in the animal soul. That says, you know what, godliness is also something that makes sense. Have you seen some people that are very pleasure-seeking? They're afraid to become more observant because they're scared, if I become more religious, I can't enjoy these enjoyable things. Don't talk to me about, kosher. Or if you want to tell me, don't talk about glad kosher, the strict things, When I was in yeshiva, in Chabad, they teach us, for example, you have to have cholav Israel, right? You can't have non-cholav Israel milk. Now, thank God, any pleasure that we want, cholav Israel makes it too. But I remember like 25 years ago in yeshiva, we had a boy. He used to run away to, what is that, Baskin and Robbins? I don't know what it was. That they have this like special milkshake that it was very tasty. He says, Rabbi, it was my classmate, says, David, I keep everything, but this thing I can't. It's like too much pleasure for me, Don't even talk about chalav Yisrael to me. Didn't want to hear it. So, a lot of people that are pleasure seeking, that's, their animal soul covering them. They're afraid to learn about godliness because they feel it's going to take away from their pleasure. So imagine their animal will understand that godliness is good. So that's what he's saying. The godly soul explains to the animal soul. It makes a little scratch.
And then they'll feel guilty when they do those things.
And they will stop doing it, as we see. And we even get to higher level. The lukutu gamken davar amuvan amusag. So after a while, the animal soul says, hey, godliness is not so bad. I can understand it. I can relate to it. Now, if somebody really works on himself, what happens is, if he transforms the animal soul to love God, actually makes the godly soul stronger too. There's a pasuk that says, Raf Tvut, you could get a lot of produce with an ox. What it means is if a person is going to plow, how much can he plow if he's going to do it with his own hand? He'll get some produce, some wheat out of the ground. But if he puts a plowshare, whatever it is, not plow, whatever it is, he's going to harvest or plow, whatever it is, with an ox, definitely a lot more will grow. Today that we have tractors, whatever machines we have, right, definitely does even more than an ox. So what they say is, the godly soul, because it's intellectual, so its emotions are weaker. Although it loves God. You have ever seen an intellectual person? He's not that emotional, not so warm, because the intellect damps and quiets the emotions. The animal soul is only emotions. It's a big desire. So imagine you transform its desire to godliness. So because the desire is a lot stronger, if it gets transformed to godliness, to love God, so that gives a boost to the godly soul too. His love becomes intensified to God also. So that's a higher level.
Once you reach that level, do you surpass Beinoni, the status of Beinoni?
It could be either a high level of Beinoni or you surpass Beinoni.
What's Beinoni?
Beinoni is a guy that doesn't do any sins, but he has a desire to do evil.
The evil thoughts, though.
Evil thoughts, evil desires. So, but there's a level of Beinoni that doesn't have no bad desires, very good Gimel, or it would actually become higher than Beinoni.
I have a hard time with the word sin and guilt. I have a hard time with those two words.
Well, let me discuss that at the end. Let me just finish. We have a few minutes to finish. I'm going to discuss that. So you see, the first thing is that you understand that there is a God. Number two thing is that if he really comes to love God, it gives a boost, it elevates the godly soul too. He will actually transform and he's going to come to love God. And when that happens, that's it, even the godly soul gets elevated. See, and over here they say we have to explain to our animal soul things that he understands. We can't learn deep things that you have no connection to. You have to talk about how good God is, things that is in the level of the world. Even let's say a regular person can understand, and then afterwards we could learn about the deeper stuff. So let me just almost finish. We almost finished. On the last paragraph on page 33. Now he says this transformation actually happened by the physical sacrifice too. What happened? But the sacrifices, they didn't only bring animals. The animal was the main part. They also brought from plants, because they had to bring flour from wheat as a meal offering. So that's from plantation. Then they had to pour, wine or put salt on the animal, right? So these are actually inanimate. I'm not saying the wine comes from a plant also, but the salt came from the sea.
How do we? So when we bring the salt from Saddam, what Saddam are they talking
No,
about?
we don't, right?
No, we don't have that now. It was a long time we have melach stomach. Now you just bring in regular salt. So I don't know if they brought it for a sacrifice or not. That was a dangerous salt, as we see another time. So we see what happens is over there, this animal or the salt or the flour was something unholy. But when it was brought as a sacrifice, it got elevated, it got transformed. So just like physically is like that, same thing is true in the spiritual sacrifice. When I bring my animal soul closer to God, so the darkness of the animal soul transforms to holiness. So it's very similar to the physical sacrifice, that the animal burnt and was consumed by the godly fire. It became godly. When the godly soul explains the animal soul to come to love God, and actually comes to love God, so we take the darkness or the evil of the animal soul and we transform it to Kedusha. Now we almost finished with Zuvas. Now you understand what the Torah says. Make me a Mishkan, make me a holy place, and I will dwell in them. It says, make me a Mishkan, a holy place, I'll dwell in them. Plural. Who's them? It's hinting that every Jew, every human being actually could be a dwelling place for God. How is that? First of all, by subduing the Yetzirah. I don't listen to my animal soul. And the main way, when we transform the animal soul to come to love God, which is a higher level, so whenever there's a challenge, either I fight the challenge, or I take that challenge and I transform it. When we do that, when we subdue or we fight against the Yetzirah, that reveals the glory of God in all the worlds. Which level of God? We actually reveal God the infinite. Okay, we finished that. Bezat Hashem, next week when we continue,
Do the kitzur?
let's do the kitzur. Yevari in Korbanos Aveda, he explains what sacrifice is in our service to God. The Adam ki yakriv, that means when a person wants to get close to God, tzarich lios mikem karban. He said two things. First of all, it really depends on him. If he wants to get close to God, he can. And he also has to sacrifice the animal within himself. We explained that there is a fire from above and there is a fire from below. What's the fire from above? Avad and Nefesh Elokis. It's the love of the godly. So you see in the temple, they used to bring fire under the korban to burn it, but then a fire came from above, from God, that was crouching like a lion and burned that up too. So we have also two types of fire: the love of the godly soul, and then is the love of the animal soul to physical things. So then the job is that just like the animal got consumed by the fire, the animal soul has to come to love God. How's that? By the godly soul investing itself in the animal soul and explaining to him the sweetness and the truth of godliness.